Okay, on your last video, I kind of walked you through what it was an amplitude, a midline, and a period. This one, I'm just going to make sure you understand these questions. This one is just asking for an equation of a midline, so I need to find the point in the middle. If you cannot eyeball it and see the point in the middle, remember you can say the maximum is 5, the minimum is 1, so the average value of 5 and 1, we could add them up and divide by 2 to find the average. That is 6 divided by 2, which is 3. Test and see if a line at 3 really makes sense. And then your answer for this one would be y equals 3. So that's all you really have to do if all it asks for is the midline. These first few should go pretty quick. I'll work on it from the next section. Okay, I know this one is asking for amplitude, but still the first thing you need to do is do the midline, and hopefully you can see pretty clearly the line in the middle of this one would be at 1. Because once you have the midline, the amplitude is really easy. It's just how far from the midline to the top. So if the midline is at 1 and the max is at 2, 2 minus 1 will give you an amplitude of 1. It is also true that you could go down 1, but I think it's easier to go up to the maximum. Your amplitude is 1 on that. We'll do one more amplitude. Once again, it's asking for amplitude, but I need the midline first. So what's in the middle of positive 1 and negative 3? The maximum at positive 1, the minimum at negative 3 would be a negative 1. If I were to add those together, I would have gotten negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1, and you can tell that line really is in the middle. Amplitude is the distance from that midline to the top. So the distance from 1 to negative 1 is 2. You can count on the graph, or you could do 1 minus negative 1 is 2, and that gives you your correct answer for the amplitude. We'll do a couple period problems together. If all it wants is the period, you don't really have to worry about your amplitude or your midline. Just pick the first non-negative maximum and the next non-negative maximum, and I like to kind of trace it out in my mind. So that's the period. That's one cycle of a graph. You notice if I went over, the next cycle is the same size, so it's that same cycle over and over. I could even go on the negative side of my graph and have another cycle about like that. So it's that same cycle over and over. The period is the length of time it takes you to do one cycle. So focusing in on the first one we marked, it starts at 0, and this cycle stops at 2 pi. So the distance from 0 to 2 pi is clearly 2 pi. You could do 2 pi minus 0, but that doesn't accomplish a lot. We'll do one more period problem. Okay, when I do these period graphs, I like to go from a maximum to a maximum, but I have a problem with my plan A here. If I look for the next maximum, you can see it's kind of off the edge of my graph, so I'm not sure exactly where it is. I could try to finish the pattern and figure it out, but a better option might be I don't have to use a maximum, although that's my first instinct. I can use a minimum point. So I have a minimum point here, and then trace back your graph until you find another minimum point. So there's 2 minimums. So it doesn't really matter if I go from maximum to maximum or from minimum to minimum, because you notice that blue piece of the graph would be the same as this next piece I'm tracing in purple. But it's kind of hard to see exactly where that ends. So looking back at my blue piece, it starts at 3/4, well, it ends at 3/4 pi, and it starts at negative pi over 4 or negative 1/4 pi. So my period would be 3/4 minus a negative 1/4, and then my answer would be in terms of pi. In Desmos, if I want the pi on my paper, I don't need to put in the calculator. So if you do that in Desmos or evaluate it by hand, you're going to get a 1 either way. Be sure you remember minus a negative becomes a positive, and then that gives you a 1. This is important to realize. You can determine period either by starting from a maximum to a maximum or a minimum to a minimum. You could start at some other point in the graph, like the midline. I find it easier for most students, though, if they either start at the maximum, my go-to, or if you have one like this where you don't see 2 maximums, start at the minimum both times, and that should always work for the period.